Stanford University.
Okay, so like she said, I'm a software engineer on the Mojo team. So have you guys at least built like a little app? You're familiar with the stage controllers, scene assistants, how all that works? Getting one nod. There's a few more nods. All right. So I'm kind of assuming that you guys are already kind of familiar with a Palm app, how they're structured and whatnot. So tell me if that's not true, and we can go and start talking about that. Okay. So what I want to talk about today is building applications that have multiple stages. So like the email app, when you tap a reply to an email, it comes up with another stage where you can compose your email. When you get a new email or message or something like that, a little dashboard comes up giving you a summary of the message, and you can tap on it and another stage comes up. Pop-ups, like the calendar, when you get a notification about an upcoming meeting, it pops up covering everything or covering the bottom half of the screen. And so those are all different types of stages that can really, make your app feel a lot more like a WebOS app, or kind of leverage some of the different things that WebOS offers. Also, relaunching. Relaunching is how apps communicate between each other. So one app that we use a lot for this is Google Maps. If you want to show a location, you can relaunch the Maps app, and it'll and pass it some parameters, and it'll show you that map. You can add this functionality to your own app so that your apps can interact with each other or with the rest of the WebOS world. And then I've got talk a little bit about what's coming in the next version of Mojo to make this stuff a little bit easier to deal with. So this is kind of complicated interactions. A big reason for that is that the web has not used this model very much. We use window.open, which in the past has almost exclusively been used for ads, pop-up ads, things that you end up blocking. So basically, nobody has built a framework around using window.open. So there's some assumptions you can make when you have one global context that you can't make when you have a bunch of different windows open. To make that even worse, you've got like 3 different types of windows. In a browser, when you open a window, it's just another window. When you open a new window in WebOS, it could be a dashboard, it could be a pop-up. It could be, we have a few like super windows that do different things, and then there's like regular stages, cards. Then there are performance issues. So normally when you open a new window, it loads all of your JavaScript, and you can just interact with your globals as you normally would. In WebOS, we can't load a new instance of Mojo every time. It's a huge framework. So what we end up doing is just loading it at app start time, and then kind of aliasing that into every child. So because of that, it's very difficult to reference things properly, because you might need to reference something in your parent window. And because of these multiple windows, you can't trust that your global context is set up the way you might want. You can't assume that document is correct. You can't assume that window is correct. So this means things like jQuery, prototype, libraries that rely on those things being true don't work correctly in a app that has multiple stages. Of course, if you keep it to one stage, you should be able to use those no problem. Also, Mojo 1.0 was thrown together pretty quickly. So there's a lot of, when we tried to resolve these performance issues is when these things came up. Realizing that developers were going to need to work around this global context thing created an issue where we just kind of threw an API together. So it's a little bit rough. We're working on it, and we're sorry about that. Okay, so let's talk about some of the basics here. So there's really 2 sides of this. There's the interaction side. Why do you need another stage? Do you need a stage every time? So like the web browser originally, every time you opened a new tab, it actually opened in the same window. Then they started to realize that was kind of a poor interaction model. So now it opens a new card every time. The compose window, on the other hand, in the email app, it only opens, well, compose windows will open a lot, but read windows, there's only one of those. Anytime you read an email, it replaces the old card, so you don't end up with a ton of different We've got adapters, a ton of different cards. And then on the technical side, you've got to watch out for these global variables, jQuery, prototype, document. All of those things can't be trusted anymore, so you have to work around those. And then also state sharing between children. You don't really have a direct reference to all of your different cards except through one global assistant, which we'll talk about. So it's very difficult to share. Generally, you have to kind of message back and forth. Okay. All right. Thanks. I'll pull up an example app in a second. So there's a few basic APIs that we have to deal with multiple stages. The first one, actually creating a stage, is create stage with callback. This is a complicated wrapper around window.open, but basically you come up with a name, you come up with an assistant that's actually going to be your stage assistant. So normally when you have a WebOS app, you have a default stage assistant that you push a scene. You can also specify a particular stage assistant that'll deal with your children. An HTML file name, so the HTML that you're going to load. Generally, you don't need to put this. Most WebOS apps have index.html that's just blank and has mojo.js being loaded. That's generally exactly what you need. So a lot of times that's unnecessary. And I've got a trailing comma there. And then a callback. So when this window is finally opened, you'll get a callback and you can do things with the stage controller reference that you're passed in. Normally, that's like pushing a scene. Okay, so then once you have a new window open, you can do anything with it that you could with a regular window, except that you have to be careful about these globals. So every stage controller has document window, navigator, aliased across it so that you can reference the correct document no matter where your code's actually executing. So here I'm getting a reference to the stage controller and then referencing the document that's attached to that stage controller. So even though this code will be executing in the original Windows context, it knows to manipulate the child stage's document because you referenced the correct document. So this is something that once you move to a multi-stage app, you have to be careful of, because if you've just referenced document anywhere, you've got to make sure you're referencing the document that's attached to the correct stage controller. And then once you get a reference to that element, you know that that element's within the correct document, so you can just do regular DOM manipulations with it. Okay. So then we have a few more helpers if you're actually in a scene assistant. This is kind of the low-level how things actually work API. But then there's some helpers once you're in a scene assistant. This .controller, or meaning your scene controller, has get, listen, and stop listening helper functions, which will allow you to, or which always use the correct stage. So if you use those throughout your app, once you add a new stage to your app, if you use these to begin with, you'll be fine. And these are the most common pitfalls, adding and removing event listeners and getting elements out of the correct document. Okay, so there's 3 different stage types. Adjusting. That we're going to worry about today. Card, which is pretty basic. It's just another card. Dashboard, which is a little 48-pixel notification on the bottom. And pop-ups, which kind of dominate the scene, or the bottom of the scene. They cover up any banners or dashboards, and they're meant to be like high priority. You should pay attention to this now. That being said, they don't stop you from interacting with the top half of the screen. Nothing in WebOS, completely takes the UI. Okay, so I've built a basic app, not pretty or anything, that just has a banner, and after the banner goes away, has a dashboard. This was originally a presentation for Palm Developer Day, so it's kind of oriented towards that. And then when I click this, it changes the text. So we'll kind of walk through the code for that. Maybe, if I can get back. Okay. Okay, so this is the main assistant, the first scene that just pushes the dashboard. You saw that as soon as I opened the app, the dashboard came up with the banner. So this does that. Go back to that original API, create stage with callback, the name, creatively named dashboard. The assistant name is dashboard stage assistant. And then we just keep a reference to our dashboard so that we can update it later on once I click the done button. So that done button has a listener attached to it. And when it's clicked, it just calls an update function on the assistant. And I had to write that update function. I'll show it to you in a second here. Does that make sense? All right. Okay, so here's the dashboard stage assistant. It's got a setup function just like every other stage assistant. And so I first put up the banner. So to do that, mojo.controller.getAppController will give you the app controller. And then hanging off of the app controller is the show banner function. You can see all of these on developer.palm.com, but it's pretty straightforward. Normally, you just want message text, and if you want it to vibrate, you put sound class vibrate, and it'll kind of buzz. After that comes relaunch parameters, which we'll talk about in a minute, and then a category. A category is how you would clear it. So there's a converse to the show banner called clear banners, and you would pass it the category, and it'll clear all the banners that had that category name. After that, I just push the scene and set a default message, which you guys should have seen. And there's an update function that will just call into my scene assistant. This is kind of hacky because it assumes there's only one scene, but it's a dashboard, so there's normally only one scene. So get the active scene and then update its title message count, and then finally update the HTML. Okay, so let's take a look at the markup for the dashboard. Now, this is kind of painful because there's a lot of boilerplate, and most of these CSS classes are just Palm-defined CSS classes. If you want it to look like a Palm dashboard, you pretty much just have to have this markup. You can find it on developer.palm.com, but it's painful in that you have to have pretty much exactly this. This is something we're going to fix in the future, but for now, you just kind of have to copy and paste. Okay, so I've set some IDs so that I can get to those particular elements, the count, title, message, which you saw back here are what's getting updated. Okay, so this is a message assistant that actually does all that magic. When it's constructed, title, message, count are passed in. It sets attributes on itself. Uses this.controller.get, so you know that you're getting the right element. That's the most common mistake, so I'm going to keep emphasizing that. And then get the different elements and call my own update dash, which just sets the inner text on the different elements. So if you see that inner text equals this.title, that's going to set the contents of this div to be my title. Does that make sense? Everybody on the same page? All right. Okay, so to walk all the way through it, dash assistant.update is going to call into this update, which is going to set the scene assistant's title message count, then call update dash. So we'll go down to update dash and just set we've saved the references to my elements there, and so it'll just set the inner text. Pretty straightforward. All right, let's do pop-ups. Okay, does the same dashboard thing, then does a pop-up, and we can hide the pop-up or click the close there. Not very exciting, but I'm sure you guys can come up with something more interesting. Okay, so to make all that happen, we're going to refactor the child stage so that we can use it for both the dashboard and the pop-up. We're going to start using some styles that you'll have seen elsewhere in Mojo apps, and they're going to be different. So the reason for this is that in child stages, we load a subset of the style sheets, and they're actually different style sheets. So when you have a poem button style in a pop-up, it looks different than a poem button style in a regular card. We need to load different style sheets not only for the look and feel, but because style sheets are really expensive to load. So we try to load a minimum number of styles. What this means is that you'll sometimes put a style on something that you could use in a regular Mojo app and it won't work. In that case, you're pretty much just going to have to reconstruct that style by copying it out. It's a performance optimization, but it's necessary. Okay, also pop-ups can have their height specified, which makes them different from any other child stage. So you can definitely get exactly the right look that you're going for. And I'll show off how to close the child windows. Okay, so the new child stage assistant doesn't really do anything. We're going to do everything in our callbacks now because this no longer has a way of knowing whether it should be pushing the dashboard or it should be pushing the pop-up. I kept the update dashboard function in there. This really could just be an update function that passes a generic message to whatever child it has, but I've only got the dashboard, so a bit of a hack. Okay, so this is modification from the main assistant that we had before. Now instead of just saving off a reference to my dashboard, it actually does all this other stuff that used to be in the dashboard stage assistant. So in the stage assistants, you've got a reference to your controller, as do you when in your create stage with callback. So you can do those things in either place, however it makes the most sense. So now that we want a child stage assistant that's more generic, I'm moving more of this functionality into the actual scene assistant that's making the decisions. The code's basically the same though. Save off the reference there at the end, just like we did before. Does that make sense? I think I've lost some. Okay, so the pop-up button that I showed you that pops up the actual pop-up does the same thing as the dashboard, except it does it for a pop-up. You say that the type of the stage is pop-up alert. The assistant name is our generic child stage. Give it a height, give it a name, and push the pop-up scene, which we'll have defined and written just like any other scene in a Mojo app, and save off a reference. So this is my pop-up scene. As you can see, it's got standard palm button classes with affirmative, negative to make the red and green, and then just the generic one for the info button. Again, this is like illustrating that the style sheets are different. They're going to have different looks. And then I've got an ID so that I can reference the close button. Okay, so this is the pop-up assistant. It's really simple because it doesn't do anything except close itself. And I'm just listening to listening for the tap event. Again, doing self.controller.listen rather than document.add event or document.getElement by ID. This guarantees that you'll be in the right stage, and then you can do self.controller.window, and that will guarantee that you've got the right window that you're trying to close. If you just did window.close, you would actually close your app because the vast majority of this JavaScript is actually executing in your parent window. Good there? All right. And then I showed that to you. Okay, so are there any questions on creating stages? Relaunching is like a whole different thing. So creating stages, how they interact.
I have a more general question. So when you create an application, when you tilt it, does it automatically change orientation, or do you have to code that?
You have to code that you want the orientation changes.
Okay.
Yeah. Other than that, a lot of times you'll want to do something different, but not necessarily. It's HTML, so it'll automatically expand.
If you don't do that, then it'll just stay upright.
Yeah.
Usual.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's definitely something to think about because your layout is going to be 480 pixels instead of 320. But most apps look fine at 480. And then it's different on Pixie too. So there's lots of considerations once you start getting into orientation events. Anything else? All right. So relaunching is when the application manager is asked to launch your application with a set of parameters. This happens when your app is tapped on, but the parameters are empty. Anytime you get an empty parameters object, it basically means just do what you normally do. If you were to relaunch maps or something, you would give it a lat long, and it would look at its relaunch parameters and say, hey, I've got a lat long, I should show the map there. So with this comes the app assistant. Have you guys put app assistants in your apps at all? No? Okay. So when you have a default Mojo app, you've got a stage assistant, and then you start adding scene assistants. You can also optionally put an app assistant in there. And an app assistant will be universally available amongst all of your stages. So this is the best way to communicate between stages, is to have an app assistant. An app assistant is also called when you get relaunched. So it can make decisions on what stages it should open, what scenes it should push onto those stages, and whatnot. So this is, if you have a complex app that has these types of behaviors, you'll definitely want an app assistant to manage those things. And an app assistant looks exactly like a stage assistant or a scene assistant. It's got a setup method, it's got a cleanup method. And then it's got some special methods like handle relaunch. Yeah, and I just talked about this. Okay, so here's an example app assistant. I don't really need to do anything on setup or anything like that. So on handle launch, I'm actually just setting the inner text of some scene that I randomly decided to choose and putting the message in there. So I can actually show what happens there. Okay, so if I click on this, it'll send a relaunch request, and then it just puts the message that I passed into the inner HTML. So I'll show you the code that does that now. Okay, so I changed my app controller show banner to actually have some launch parameters. So these are actually going to be passed into the handle launch function that I have here and set the inner text of that div. So I passed in, tapped on the greeting, and you saw tapped on the greeting. Okay. So one confusing thing that I have here is that I've got this reference to this.default stage. Now that doesn't exist. That's not a Mojo thing. We don't give you a reference to the default stage. So instead, I just, in my default stage assistant that you get with every Mojo app by default, I just stuck it on there. Got my app controller, got the assistant, and set default stage to myself. That way, I always have a reference to that stage. And then when I call appcontroller.showBanner, it'll go to the right place. Generally, what you're going to do when you get relaunched is like figure out what scene you want to push. That's the most common thing. To go back to the Google Maps thing, it decides that it wants to push the map or the search or something like that. Okay, so that was a real quick tour through relaunching. Does that make sense? Everybody on getting laughs. Or a smile at least. Which seems to indicate to me that it did not make sense. Didn't make sense?
Oh, no.
All right. All right, so we're going to try to make this better. Dashboards aren't going to require the markup boilerplate. You're just going to say, here's how many messages I have, here's some text, here's a title, and it's going to look right. It's very rare that people change the look and feel of their dashboards, so it makes sense to take care of this common case. We're also going to take care of stacking dashboards. So like if you've got multiple messages that stack on top of each other, this will take care of that. Singleton Stages will also take care of the case where you get relaunched multiple times and don't know whether you've opened the right stage. So right now we've got this get stage proxy API that will give you a proxy object if somebody has already opened your stage. That'll just work now. So barely anybody actually uses the stage proxy API. They just assume it won't happen. It's a race condition. So we're going to take care of that. If you indicate that your stage is a singleton stage, there should only be one instance of the stage at any given time, like the email list, or even the compose window is a singleton stage. So wait, no, compose window is not a singleton stage. What was that?
The reading?
Yeah, the reading. Yeah, anytime that you have a stage that if somebody asks to open it again, it is the same stage used over again. Things that aren't singleton stages are the compose window or a browser window, because you can open the same stage multiple times. In that case, we can't tell whether you wanted to actually open a new stage or not. But if you indicate that this is a singleton stage, we'll take care of that, and we'll also report back failure if it didn't open correctly, which is actually more common than you might think. The out-of-memory error causes failures, or if somebody swipes the card off before it's gotten all the way through its setup. So that's all going to be taken care of. And going to be massaging the App Assistant API. I don't really have specifics of that, but to make it so that closing down apps is a little bit more elegant, because right now it's very difficult to, say, save off a bunch of state when your app is swiped off, because it generally just collapses right on the spot. The way to kind of do that now is to be saving state as you're going along, but for like games and things like that, sometimes it's difficult, so we're going to try to clean that up. So you have a definite way of saving things off. And that's really all I had for you. You guys got any questions?
What about the memory management? Let's say your stage goes off. Does it like save everything, or is it all keeping it all in memory? Like, how much do you, as a developer, have to worry about, like how much memory and stuff is taking up?
You don't really have to worry about anything. And that's one of the reasons that you run into these memory limitations so often, is that we do keep all of those cards in memory.
Oh, okay.
We'll page them off sometimes, so sometimes it's slow to bring them back in. But there currently is no API for saying, hey, you're taking too much memory, we need to shut you down. It's really up to the users to close down when they're told, hey, it's taking too much memory. That being said, you can leak if you have references to DOM nodes that are referenced by a closure. So if you don't remove your event handlers properly, that's one area where this happens a lot. You'll end up leaking a lot of memory. And if your app stays open for a long time, that can be an issue. But as soon as it's flicked off, that all goes away. If you're downloading huge amounts of data from the internet or from a service or wherever, you probably want to dereference that data as quickly as possible once you turn it into nodes, or if you don't need to keep it around. Just obvious things. Anytime you have a reference to something in JavaScript, it's going to stick around. So if you take that reference away, it'll go away. So just keep that in mind. DOM nodes that don't need to be in the DOM, don't put them in the DOM. Just things like that. Basically, anything that's going to make your app perform faster is also going to make it less memory intensive. That's not always true. It's sometimes true. Anything else? You guys are quiet. You guys enjoy? What do you guys think of Mojo so far?
It's not too hard to work with. I don't know. I think it'd be more helpful if you had like actual example code snippets online rather than just having like a one-liner thing.
Oh, so you mean within the documentation?
Right.
Okay. Have you seen the GitHub repository? We need to emphasize that a little bit more. If you go to github.com/palm, there's a few little sample apps there, and there's also the news app, which was the app that the Palm WebOS book walked through the creation of. So it has most of the elements of a standard WebOS app that you can look through. And then Ben and Dion put up new example code there. fairly frequently. But you're right, we need to do a better job of linking off to that. Have you guys used other JavaScript frameworks? What's the experience in this room? None? So I'd encourage you to go and check out how some of the other frameworks accomplish these same things. It's, web development is at a pretty exciting time because there's no standard way of saying out of HTML elements, here's how you want to construct a widget, something that has more complex behaviors. So every widget-oriented JavaScript framework has done it in a different way. And then there's the lower level ones that do DOM manipulations in a different way, like jQuery or Prototype or MooTools or something like that. So if you're interested in web development, it's kind of interesting to see how other people do it.
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.